the average vehicle kilometres travelled by people has actually peaked and is starting to drop away. So whereas traditionally agencies who are responsible for investment in transport infrastructure have assumed that vehicle kilometres travelled is going to continue up and therefore we're going to have to keep building more roads and more road infrastructure, suddenly all over the world these curves are starting to flatten off. And so there are new changes having to occur within the investment decisions of transport authorities.
Up till around 2004, we saw a rapid increase in the total vehicle kilometres travelled and the amount of people were driving. It was going up at about 3% per year. From 2004 to 2012, that was flat. It seems that younger people typically are starting to drive slightly later. There's also a marked decrease in the amount people drive when they reach 65 or when they retire. And you've also seen economic impacts through the global financial crisis and uncertainty about whether people will have a job.
So energy culture in its most simple way says that what we do doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens really because we're responding to other things in our lives. And importantly, what we're responding to is the things that surround us, the physical things that we have in our lives, and also the norms or expectations that we have about our everyday life. So what is it that we think is normal and expected in the way we live our lives? And so these three things, our actions or activities, and the physical things we have, and how we think, what our norms are, all interact with each other quite strongly to actually build up patterns of behaviour that become normalised and I guess habitual in our everyday lives. When we think about mobility cultures, it's the interplay between what we have, what we do, and what our expectations are around our transport. In New Zealand, we tend to have a mobility culture generally that's really largely fixed around our cars, so you might call it car culture. But the research that we've done indicates that although people use cars for most of their mobility needs in their everyday lives in New Zealand, there is a bit of a mismatch because a lot of New Zealanders actually have aspirations, that is thinking about that bubble of norms. A lot of people have aspirations to use active transport a whole lot more, so to walk and cycle more than they do, or to use public transport more than they do. But somehow there's this mismatch between what they're actually doing and what their aspirations are. But that mismatch actually creates a bit of an opportunity or an opening for policy interventions to actually support change in that way, so to support people to actually meet their own aspirations.
We shouldn't think of ourselves as a victim to circumstance, but rather the captain of our own destiny. And we're able to take a decision by the investments that we make, which will affect the transport choices we have. We have a choice ourselves as a nation. A key thing that we want to encourage is a debate on what the nation wants. We've created 4 different visions of the future of the transport system. We've seen a rapid increase in the numbers of people who are travelling by air. Just like you might use your smart card in Wellington or hop a card in Auckland, you'll have a card like that and just swipe on an aeroplane. Electric vehicles will become far more common. We think that the cost of electric vehicles will decrease significantly over the next 10-15 years. Efficiency measures will drive far more efficient combustion engines. It won't be 1 litre to drive 10 kilometres, it will be 1 litre to drive 100 kilometres. In our vision, we do see that we will see self-driving vehicles and we'll no longer need to regulate whether somebody can drive, because people won't drive, they will be driven. We've gone from a situation where we used a map to find our way around to having sophisticated GPS, to being told information of when the bus will arrive. And we think the next evolution will be that we become the managed part of the system, and we will be told when there is a slot available in the transport system to get us from where we are to where we need to be.
Sometimes energy cultures change when there isn't any obvious single cause, and that is really, really interesting. And we're seeing those kinds of changes happening in people's transport lives right now. So one fascinating example is how quite a lot of young people these days are opting out of owning cars. And this change amongst what we call Generation Y is really being seen as a change in the culture of young people's mobility, and particularly around their daily practices. So instead of hopping in a car to get somewhere, they tend to use active transport. They walk, they cycle, they use public transport, and also they use social media, and of course they share cars with other people. And there's, I guess, a whole norm shift here, which is about thinking in different ways about transport and thinking about getting from A to B as not being so much as a problem if it takes time, but actually enjoying the time it takes. So here's a wonderful example of how mobility culture shifts are actually driving some changes in the general structure around and making transport authorities and others having to think about transport provision in quite new ways.
We value the research community immensely. We are here to provide advice to ministers on issues, and there are often views which are expressed where people are very passionate about an issue and they will want change, but there are always trade-offs, and so when you're providing advice, one of the key things to have is evidence to allow you to provide advice which will deliver the best outcome for New Zealand.
So the energy cultures framework helps us think about a really complicated situation in a relatively simple way. If people do start changing their energy culture, whether it's because of outside influences or because they're actually changing their norms, wanting to do things quite differently, like Generation Y around mobility, then when people start changing those energy cultures and that starts creating a collective change, then those collective changes can actually start to influence externally and can start to change the way companies run their businesses. It can start to change the sorts of infrastructure that governments need to provide. It starts to change maybe some of the policy mechanisms that governments have. So that framework, although it's very simple, invites us to think about all of the different parts of this very complex system and think about both what locks us into stability or habit, and also what it is that drives change.